So thank you again so much for doing this. And we missed you at the New York Public Library that night. I wish I had gotten to meet you that night.
I wish I got to meet you too. On that exact night, I was in Ohio teaching a week-long class, and we lost power for 24 hours. It was crazy. We really banded together, but you were in a better place.
Oh my goodness, that's so crazy. Did everything turn out okay for the workshop that you were teaching?
Yeah, everything turned out okay. It was sort of fun to have to adjust, and it felt a little like camping. You know, we were eating sandwiches because the dining hall at the college was completely out of power. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, well, it was memorable at least, right?
It totally was. It's memories for a long, long time.
Well, I love Something New Under the Sun, your novel. I had an amazing experience reading it. And I think also just, it was so fun for me because I live in Los Angeles and I've lived here for 20 years. So it
Yeah,
made me feel like the city was a character. Have you lived in Los Angeles before, or was that all research?
yeah. I lived there when I was a kid, and it was a time when I moved over from the East Coast, and I had the feeling so often, continuously, just every day, what is this place? You go from these lush lawns to just 20 feet away, it's bramble and it's desert, and there's coyotes prowling back there. So it was one of the most interesting places I lived, and it's a place that really stuck with me for its contradictions and the amount of wildness that still lives there.
Yeah, you feel it in the novel. When I was reading it, kind of not knowing anything about you yet, just reading the novel for what it was, and I was like, this person must live in LA because it's captured with such detail of all of that nuance, which is really it's cool when you live here because you're like, oh, I recognize this. I recognize how kind of confusing and juxtaposed all these things are, and we live in it here. So it was really cool.
Oh, that means so much to me. I mean, my biggest fear, because I lived in LA as a kid, and then I've gone back for research. I'm from Colorado, which is also a similarly dry state, but of course it's very different. We don't have a drop of ocean for thousands of miles.
Right.
My biggest fear was that a real Angelino would go, "This looks nothing like my city." And I feel like your seal of approval goes a long way.
Oh yeah, no, I totally, I bought it. It's such a fascinating novel because I felt like there were so many twists that I didn't see coming. It's like when you start reading the book, you think it's one thing. You're like, oh, okay, this writer, Patrick, he's a novelist and a writer coming to LA, trying to make it, trying to prove things to his family. And you think that that's not the journey you're on. And the twists and turns are so unexpected. And also, and I'm curious to hear what your early thought process in was with this, because all this stuff with, how do you pronounce it? The WATR brand?
I say what are.
What are? Okay, yeah, I was curious about that.
Something out of your throat.
That's great. So all of that stuff felt, I just loved how you approached it as if it was all just how it is right now. It didn't feel futuristic, even though it's slightly futuristic, and it made it feel so unnervingly possible. What was your approach to all that? When you were starting to put together the structure, like, did you see a whole outline from start to finish? Did you have a sense of the what are storyline and the way that it fit into it being kind of made normal in this world?
Absolutely. One of the big things for me, I had this really tiny, completely vague idea that I wanted to write about climate change. And the question was how to do that, because so many ways I think that we talk about it make it feel sort of strange and immense, but far away. And other ways also feel like they're so far in the future that they don't touch our everyday lives. So
Yeah.
I was trying to think about what might work, and two things I sort of seized on were I was really fascinated by this feeling that I was having more and more, that my daily concerns, the things I was thinking about doing for myself, for my career, for my life in that day, would be pushed aside by an environmental disaster that was related to climate change. For example, like um, planning to go on a trip for a hike into the mountains and finding out there's a forest fire burning just like over the ridge from where we are. We have to cancel everything and go because we actually feel the smoke on the wind coming toward us.
Yeah.
Um, down to, driving across the country to get back to teach for my first day of semester. We got almost all the way across, and then in New Jersey, we encountered this huge flood at the beginning of the fall last year, and we couldn't
Wow.
go on any streets. The highways were closed. We had to find a place to stay, and it was like, what's going to happen to my first day of class? Except classes were all canceled because New York was flooding too. Yeah. So it's that feeling of, your whole world seems um, close and personal and very solid and very important until something bigger pushes it out of the way. And it's awkward and alarming, and it is increasingly like a feeling I think that goes along with everyday life now. So
Yeah.
yeah, I wanted to think of this book as, sort of like plate tectonics. In geology, there's a thing where the plates that are floating on magma in our continents collide, and one of them sinks under the other and gets melted down into liquid magma. It's called subduction, and I feel like that's sort of what our reality is like now. We find our own concerns sort of being overridden by something bigger that takes over. So the
Wow.
second story kind of becomes more important by
That
the
is
end.
such a great analogy, because I know I've been talking a lot about that. We've all talked, everyone's talking about their own versions of trying to understand what we're all facing and going through. And I mean, it's probably most definitely going to be even worse and harder as time continues. I don't think that we're on the upswing of anything right now. So it's probably going to get more and more intense. But we're in this time where in the old days, of course we all, the bad news gets printed because that's what gets anyone's attention, right? But the bad news used to just be your town's bad news that you knew about, not the whole country and then every other country, the whole world. Like, to be taking in the energy of an entire world's bad news all day, every day. We're not built for that. Like, we're just physically not built to consume that much bad news in a day, or process it or digest it or know what to do about it, And so I love hearing this metaphor for it. What did you call it? Subversion? Is that that it's called when
Yeah. One in plate tectonics, it's called subduction, and one plate hits the other and then it just sinks underneath.
Man, that is so intense. And it's true, right? So it's like you think, oh, I'm super worried about writing my novel or whatever. And then you're like, oh, but the world's on fire, So like
Yeah,
that's
my
more
novel is
important than worrying about my novel. Oh man. Wow, that's so wild. And you do feel that in here, it's like um the unexpected relationships. I also love that, Patrick becoming close with Cassidy, what's her last, Cassidy Carter, right?
Yes.
Sort of this young starlet who is wildly smarter than you expect her to be and more in touch with things than you expect her to be. I also love that because I feel like so often people in the film industry just get thrown under the bus as like they're dumb and crazy, and I felt like she really had her finger on the pulse of things, and she was sort of smart enough to try to mask it in this appearance of things, but that was her survival mechanism.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't know what your experience of this time was like back in the 90s, I think. I was always the same age approximately as Lindsay Lohan. So when I watched sort of her come under paparazzi fire and her reputation starts to slide, I always compared myself to her and thought, like, is she really doing something all that different from people my age and myself? Like, would my life look different if we were under the same sort of scrutiny? And now I think we're kind of in this moment where we're looking back at those things. Britney Spears, Lindsay Lohan's having a comeback, and regretting some of the ways that we participated either actively or just by being a viewer of that
Yeah.
kind of thing with women.
Oh, 100%. And I thank God we're collectively as a culture thinking through our, like you said, our participation in it or our culpability of being a part of it just by watching it and consuming it. But it's really true. I was the same. I mean, she's, I think, a couple years younger than me. But we're definitely in a different time where I think people have an awareness of it now more, and it's not that that paparazzi has gone away or people's fascination has gone away, but there does seem to be a little bit more consideration of like everyone's human, and the, someone like Britney Spears or Lindsay Lohan or any of those pop artists of that time or now, they're not pretending to be better than anyone else. We're the
Yeah.
ones who put them up on a pedestal when we watch them and admire their work, right? They didn't ask for that. They're artists who hope that other people like what they make, just like we all hope that someone likes what we make, So
Yeah.
it was really cool to read a novel where I felt like the character was given credit for that part of herself, and that she had sort of wrapped herself in this cloak of, I don't know, superstardom or something to kind of protect herself, but it really felt like her armor. It didn't feel like her identity.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I always feel a little bit like I have no idea how to make a character when I start. So for each character, I come up with a different idea of how they're organized. And for Cassidy, it was these layers, like how she seems on screen, which is the very maybe thinnest layer of a person because you only get a little bit of access to who's inside. Beneath that, how she seems to be in the public eye, how she seems to be in person, how she seems to be when you spend 4 hours with her, then 6 hours, then when you actually get to find out about one of the formative sort of memories that shaped her. And it was really important to me, I think, like we both talk about how, difficult experiences that you encounter as a celebrity may be less difficult because of their amount of privilege. But I also think that sometimes people like Lindsay Lohan and Britney Spears are the canaries in the coal mine for the sort of extractive gaze that women go under all the time. They get the most of it, but we all get a lot of it, and a lot of messages about how we should be and present ourselves and what's out of bounds for us for no clear reason, just a sort of strange absorbed consensus.
Yeah. Well, and then you feel that in Patrick's wife and her decision to go off to Earthbridge. Was there a particular sort of, I mean, wellness in general feels like it's kind of become religious sized in some way. It's not a word. I'm making up that word, but I don't, like there's something going on in like the wellness space right now that feels like this new religion people have turned to in some way. And it feels like that makes it like dangerously cultish at times, which really is encapsulated in your Earthbridge thing. Was there sort of a particular inspiration for that, or was that more of just your take on the religious wellness space right now? Or did you lose
Yeah,
me?
there's a lot of inspiration for that. More than with other things I've written, I felt in writing this book like I'm putting some of my own problems and impasses and decisions I have to make on the page, and maybe hoping a reader will figure them out for me and then email me, I think Allison should have done this. And I'll be like, okay, that's what I should do with my life. But I'm really fascinated by, uh, the wellness world, which often offers solutions that really do make me feel better and more whole. And also by like this sort of idea of the utopian community, which we understand is not utopia and is often very cultish, but I feel like we still don't have another paradigm, like another dream that we dream for how to live like the harmless and community-oriented life that we want. We always think we have to go away to join it. So she makes one of those decisions, and I think she feels ambivalent about it when she's doing it, and ambivalent about it when she's there. But the difficult thing to sort out is, am I still happier here than I would be someplace else? I feel like the answer is yes for her, with a lot of disclaimers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, it's all of your characters have this yearning to be something more than what they are, or I'm not sure if I'm articulating it right. Is that right?
Yes, that's so right. Like, you know, uh, I feel like every one of them is participating in like this dreaming that we all do. Like, where do I want my life to go? What do I think it could be? And we see such a difference in Patrick. Like, when he's sort of fantasizing about the future he thinks that he'll have when he makes it in the film industry, it's like a house in the Hollywood Hills, like with a huge trampoline, and my kids going to school with the Kardashians. Is that realistic or not? I don't know, but we all sort of got to navigate using something. And when you expose that dream to other people's eyes, I think there's always the risk that you're going to go, oh, that was a silly dream, or that was like a fantasy that doesn't seem as happy now that I've actually uttered it.
Yeah, or also just we make these weird unknown agreements with ourselves, right? That like, oh, once this happens, then I'm successful, or once this happens, it proves that other people like me. And then
Yeah.
when that's outed in some way and reflected back to you, you're like, hang on, wait, when did I make that agreement with myself that that proved something? Like it's, and why does it have such a hold on me? I identified with that because even though my dreams are different than Patrick's dreams, or like that his sense of value comes from maybe a different place that it comes from for me, it didn't have to be the same for me to relate to the way we make that stuff up in ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the funny thing about pointing yourself toward a future. You can never know if it's really the thing that's going to satisfy you. You just have to sort of trust and believe, so you feel have some sort of direction to go. And
Yeah,
that's like a very human condition thing for me, I think.
I agree. I agree. At what point did you know that you had this sense of the world and the characters, and you're talking about the tectonic plates and the thematic sort of feelings of the book, but at what point did you know that this novel was going to take such a big turn into being kind of futuristic and a little bit thrillery, I guess? Like it starts off feeling like it's very much a character driven story, and then it really shifts into being like almost like a science fiction thriller at some point. Did you know that that was in the plan, or did that sort of reveal itself as you were writing?
I knew that it was the plan for this story about water art that you weren't really paying attention to sort of take over.
Hmm.
But I didn't know what that would feel like also, because it's sort of a blend of two genres. Like, one feels a little more noir and a little closer to um, our world and how we reason about people in our world. And then the other is like an emergency sort of situation, and you're trying to get to safety, and you're trying to, reveal the big the big thing. And I think that I I thought about how much do I want it to go smoothly from one to the other, and how much do I want it to feel like we've like turned a corner. There's a little bit of a lurch, and I kind of like a little bit of a lurch sometimes, because for me as a reader, when I read a book like that, it always makes me snap into attention.
Yes.
Yeah. I really love like John le Carre novels and things like that. So I appreciate like really being in a different phase of the story than I was at the beginning.
Yeah. What's your process like as a writer? I mean, I know that you've been very prolific even before this. Like you're quite an experienced writer. So do you have rituals, or do you have a certain sort of process that you go through to feel like you've collected the amount of ideas that you want to collect, and then you're ready to start a thing, and then you are walking out that thing? You know what I mean?
Yes, I know what you mean. Uh, I One thing about me is I'm a real late night writer, which
Okay.
is inconvenient for all the other parts of my day. But I get up, I read, I have breakfast, I go, on a walk or a run, and then I start sort of preparing to write. And I usually start writing around like 11 o'clock,
Hmm.
after my partner's already gone to sleep. So the house gets totally quiet, and I'm like, uh, feeling like I can use all the stuff I stored up over the day, thinking about it and deciding what is going to happen next. So that's one thing. But it's just funny because with this book, my process changed so much from my first book. My first book, I was like, I want this book to go someplace really weird. So I'm going to play it like a video game. Every time I come to a decision point, I'm going to choose what I think is the weirder decision and see where I go. But here, I felt like a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of parts and there's a lot that happens in it. And I knew I needed to get to this point I had in mind by the end of the book. So
Yeah.
I plotted everything out. I did a huge outline, and then I made separate outline pages for each point of the outline to put other ideas I had. It was my version of organization, which still looked like a real madcap um, spill of paper. But I think that like every time you start a new project, you should be open to doing it in a new way,
Mm.
because for me, there's always an eerie feeling that comes over me when I am working on something and I've done it the way I've done another thing. I'm like, is this really right for it? I feel like I'm slipping backwards in time and I'm not putting my whole self into it because I'm doing something, a pattern I've already learned, you know.
Sure. Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, it's amazingly self-aware and brave, I think, to approach every project with a new take, because it's so easy as a person to be like, I want to fall back on this thing that made me feel safe and comfortable, and so like push past that and go like, no, I'm gonna go somewhere really uncomfortable and new, and I'm gonna embrace it. And it's really amazing. Um, so when you're in that process, what does the editing process feel like for you? Like, do you work with someone who like is kind of the voice of reason and like, let's pay attention to this or let's cut that out? Or do you do a lot of your own editing first before someone else gets involved? Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm really thinking you're also married to an actor, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think my number one reader is my husband, and he's also a writer himself. We have a lot of similar tastes, but we also have some different strengths. So it's a really good check on what my blind spots are. Like I tend to skip over doing something which he would always do, and which can remind me are very important to
Mm.
telling the story. And I think the most important thing is like um, sometimes when I was writing this, I was away in residencies, and when you're writing a novel, you don't always get eyes on it or get a pat on the back
Sure.
until
Yeah. Yeah. It's a little lonely, right?
it's a bit lonely. So like when I would finish a chapter, I would email to him and I would ask him like, hey, could you read this today? Like, could you read this in the next 3 hours? And then we talk. And it wasn't that I needed to know something specific. I just need someone to make it real with their eyes, you know?
Oh,
Uh,
wow. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
it's a thing you can only ask for from, your partner or a really good friend.
Yeah, it's tricky to find those people. I call myself sort of a baby writer. I've been writing screenplays that I've never shown anyone, and I'm now writing the first screenplay that I think I would share. And I got to page 72, which is just always I get stuck on page 72 for whatever reason when I'm writing screenplays. And I was like, I just need the producer's eyes on it. Like I just needed, like you said, I couldn't articulate it the way you were just saying it, but it was like I needed someone to reflect it back to me and be like, no, this is a real thing, and it's not just in your head, and you haven't just been alone writing this. Like it actually, the words are on the page, and it's real, and it's okay.
I love that. I love the page 72 thing, that that specific point. And I have to say, like, I'm half Taiwanese, and in Chinese superstition, the number 4 sounds like the word for death. So buildings will just not have a number 4 floor. They'll go 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7.
Oh, right,
Maybe
like our
you should
13.
not have a page 72.
What?
Maybe you should just not have a page 72, like leave it blank. The next one.
I love it. Just have page 71 and 73, but we just skip page 72. I will think about that. I feel like that's a really good idea. Yeah, I didn't know that about floor 4. That's like 13. I feel like someone didn't. Is that in your book? Is there a reference to that?
No, I don't think so, but maybe.
I,
You know,
I I'm trying to think if that was, because I feel like someone has told me that in another culture, like our floor 13 is like their floor 4. So,
Oh,
but I didn't realize like the sort of history behind it. But because when you go into a hotel or something in America, there's never a 13th floor because no one will stay on the 13th floor.
yeah, totally.
So that's floor 4 in Taiwanese.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. What was your journey in general to becoming a writer? Like, what did you know as a little girl that you wanted to be a writer? Was this like later in life? Like, what was your journey there?
Yeah, uh it's a good question. I think my first thing was just being a reader,
Mhm.
Um having this wonderful thing, reading, that you could do whenever you wanted, wherever you were. If you didn't love the situation you were in, you could like pick up your book and just fall into that world. And it made that space very real to me, and a very important place to put my feelings and to think through things. So I think that was the first part. And then it was actually a longer path for me to get to writing fiction, because I felt very much like, I know myself, but do I know any other person well enough to write a character? And I wrote poetry, I wrote essays, I really loved science writing. And it was only, when I read some work by people like Angela Carter or Robert Coover, who were using fairy tales, that I was like, well, I know a fairy tale, and I know what the sort of feelings are that go along with that, and how they're sort of feelings that belong to everyone, but don't have to belong to a specific person. You don't need to tell the backstory of that character going through that. So I got in that way, and I started exploring these things that I felt like were not my natural tendencies, were not my strengths. I love that, in any type of practice you have, you can start out one place and like have your center there, but then explore all of these areas that you feel, are foreign to you, and begin to add them to
Yeah,
what you do.
it's
Yeah.
really, yeah. And and you feel that in the novel. I mean, I feel like in hearing you talk about this, I hear your heartbeat in the structure of the novel, in terms of the way that it reveals itself. Um, I feel like you could write an entire novel about Earthbridge. Has that ever crossed your mind? Is there any temptation to explore Allison and her journey there more?
Yeah. Uh, One of the things I really wanted, and hoped I could make work in the book, was to have most of it with my LA characters, but spend one chapter in Earthbridge, and be like, look, there's this whole world there. There's a whole world everywhere, and we're only ever seeing one part of it at a given time.
Yeah.
And to sort of pop out and do that. And I loved it. I was fascinated by it, and I would like to write about it more, which is why I think what I'm working on next is a little bit about utopias and communities, and just thinking about what the difficulties are, and what great things can happen when we decide we're making a community ourselves.
Yeah. Well, and also, it's interesting because in Earthbridge got me thinking about this a lot in the way that even though you kind of pop in and out of it just little bits until the full chapter there, it's just like this whole idea of like, nowhere is actually going to be perfect. Like humans are so different, and we all have such different needs and different perspectives and different histories that take us to a certain moment, that there's no way you're ever going to have a space where everyone's just like, oh yeah, great, let's all get along. Like it might start that way, but it will evolve into conflict. And
Yeah.
how do we, like the collective we, get to a place where there's a healthy version of conflict? I mean,
Yes.
obviously that was sort of the idea with democracy. It's like, oh, you're allowed to debate and you're free to debate. It's okay. You can have we've moved so far from that kernel of like conception, right? But how as a do we like put things in the world where we could consider this idea of like healthy, productive conflict without it being like, you're right, I'm wrong, or I'm right and you're wrong. Like, and I think utopia keeps trying to, like, the idea of utopia keeps trying to tackle that, but we keep not finding the actual utopia in it. Is that something that you're interested in? Because it feels like it's kind of sizzling through in this novel.
Absolutely. I think about that a lot, and I think about why conflict feels so incendiary in places like social media. And sometimes I think it also has to do with not being able to see or know the person that you're responding to or talking to. Like these things like when there's no body and there's no body language or smile or shared space, it feels so much easier to just write someone off.
Yeah.
And when you live in a smaller community, I feel like you can't do that for better and for worse. In reading about utopian communities, I think there was one. I think it was called the Fourierists, and his thing was no community should ever be more than 250 people or something like that.
Oh, I feel like I've heard that theory. Yeah.
All these little ones, and I mean, it gets real crazy and whimsical what he did, but there's something I think about being in a smaller group. You're going to see the person you have a conflict with. How are you going to deal with that? What kind of way can you find to sort of live with each other's differences? Maybe it's just a necessity in a smaller world that we don't deal with as much when we live, on the one hand, with our feet on the ground in our own local place, but also in this global, like, bad news factory.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's something worth considering because it's like, I was listening to a podcast recently and they were talking about the sideways effect, like how the movie Sideways, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Sideways, but it was like about
Why?
wine. Yeah. Yeah. And so they did this deep dive into investigating how whether or not the movie Sideways affected the sales of Merlot because one of the main characters goes on this rant about how he hates Merlot and how it's sort of like this lesser wine or whatever. And the sales for Merlot, like it used to be the highest selling Merlot in America, and the sales just completely plummeted around that time. And so they do this whole investigation in this podcast into like whether or not it really was because of this movie or not. And everyone has different perspectives. Like they're like, it definitely impacted people's attitudes about it because you have all these people who don't know about wine. And so when you have someone act like an expert on screen like that, they're like, oh shoot, well, I guess I should buy anything but Merlot because this guy, I remember that he said it was bad, right? But then they make the point that at the same time as Merlot dipped was the same time that I guess Chardonnay also dipped in sales with almost the same percentage. And they don't make fun of that wine or they don't talk down to that wine in the movie, right? So they were like, well, was there already a natural thing that was happening just culturally where people's tastes were shifting somewhere else, or maybe the grapes weren't as good? And because it had been the biggest sale, then maybe it was overproduced, whatever. We don't have to get that far into it. But my point being, it made me think a lot about the way art impacts culture, whether it's everyone wants to buy the next James Bond car or, everybody wants the computer that's on so-and-so's desk in some big movie or some big series or whatever. It's like, that makes me think about the way we're all digesting the ideas that are in novels and in film and on television. And so much of what we have all kind of allowed to be critically acclaimed is like everything's dark and everything's nihilistic, like that for whatever reason, like the dark and nihilistic things are allowed to be well reviewed. Whereas like anything that's positive or has hope in it seems like it's like dismissed as being cheesy. And I'm like, wait, how do we find a balance and recalibrate this? Because if we're not dreaming that possible positive future and putting the possibility of that in our art, how are we going to make it happen, right?
That is such a great question. That is like the big question. And I feel you're right. There's such a, pessimism bias. And I feel like for a while, I thought I might be in academia and, being critical is very rewarded. I mean, maybe for good reason, but I feel exactly what you're talking about, that we don't have on screen as many examples of ways things could be that are better that we could work toward. Like it's as though in not showing them, we're told they're not possible, but they are possible. They're as possible as anything else,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's part of the reason I bring it up with you is just because I feel like there's again, I'm using this word yearning because I feel like there is just like a lot of yearning in a really powerful way in your work, but it's like there is this sort of yearning from your characters and from your locations and from the overarching themes of like, yeah, these bad things are happening, but I'm realizing in that I really appreciate my wife and my child, or this, this, yes, I realize that people see me as superficial, as Cassidy, but like, that really she's kind of crossing all her T's and dotting all her I's to try to protect herself and to survive so that she can have a more fulfilling career or can be surrounded by people who take her seriously, and with Allison going to Earthbridge with her daughter, it's like something's missing in my life and I'm going to make a decision to try to feel more or to try to fill those holes in some way. And so I feel like it's such a beautifully like subversive way of tackling that, where it's like, yes, dark things are happening, and yes, the world is complicated, but there's something in our humanity that's going to keep driving us toward optimism in some way.
Yes. Yes, yeah, I think there's a lot to be pessimistic about, certainly, but there's a lot that we find in ourselves when we're responding to a crisis. Like, I hate to go back to uh, losing power during my
Yes.
college
Yeah.
week. But my biggest concerns that day when I was getting up were like, am I going to be able to print for all my students? What a disaster it'll be if we can't print. But when there were no printers, there were lights, thankfully, due to a generator. There was no, power in the dining hall. There was no power in our homes. When you toss all that away, and we went, well, what can we do in class today? We had an amazing time. We did this amazing improvised activity, writing characters and then making them interact with one another in our writing.
Oh, how
Um,
cool.
yeah, and sometimes I think that crisis can really bring us together and help us see other things in ourselves. Like in Cassidy, for example, um, she was for a while taken care of. She felt like she didn't have the ability to sort of be there for other people as other people were there for one another, and she became very isolated. But even in just caring for Patrick, who she doesn't feel an automatic connection to, and learning that she can do that just like anyone else and that she's a lot more than she thought, it's a powerful thing for her.
Yeah.
There's a whole world of possibilities that open up for her when she starts thinking of herself differently and thinking of her own capacities. And even though there's a crisis backgrounding that or foregrounding that, I feel hopeful for her going forward in a way that I don't for
Yeah.
yeah.
And also I feel like there's a little bit of this corporate concern that sort of reflected in there in the Watar company being like, this idea of like somehow kind of under the radar that water became privatized the same way so many other things become privatized, and then how we all just, well, not we all, but like how a lot of people can just sort of accept that because it is it's what happened, and so it's what's normal. And I felt like that was something that was like a really powerful underpinning to the book as well. It's this idea that like everyone in LA has just accepted in your novel that water is privatized and it's coming in this box and it's been, turned over to a corporation as opposed to it being this thing that is regulated and given to you as a human right almost.
Yes, I think that there are some really poignant examples of sort of privatization trying to happen right now that I think are alarming. Like, I'm just focusing on fire safety, fire prevention. Like, I know that uh, in some areas, like I think LA is one, there are private for hire fire companies that people might hire to protect their house specifically, that can supposedly, do a better job, or will not allow anything to happen to your house when, uh, a larger program with a lot of places to tend to and a lot of things to worry about may have to do some cost benefit analysis, or may say we can't get there. But if you hire a company just to surround your house, maybe your house will be fine. But what about your neighbor's house? And what about, you know, fire is this great example of how crisis doesn't happen to just one person. It spreads and happens to whole groups of people. So when we sort of stand together and pool our resources, we can do a much better job than we can as individuals, especially one individual with the ability to hire a private company, and 99% of people who can't.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we should look at what we have. We have a lot of great community protections and the commons of things that are supposed to benefit all of us, and they're a thing that we want to strengthen and not lose.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of us. Yeah.
It's so nice talking to you. I'm realizing we're getting really close to the end of our time, but my last question is just, what's the greatest piece of advice that you've been given, and or that you've read somewhere, and from whom or from where?
Well, maybe this is more particular to writers, but I think that it has to do with a lot of other realms of life and creation too. I had a professor once who, in my writing, said, like, I see what you're building up to, and think about how exciting it would be if you started with the last thing you know, the thing you're building up to, and just see what happens next. And I was like,
Wow.
yeah.
Start
Okay.
from what you build to instead of building to that thing. Oh, whoa.
Too.
Oh, that's so challenging.
No, but I think, like, it's great to remember there are some really actually literally risky things in life, but in the realm of of creating something, of performing, of writing music, of making art, and of getting out there and forming community, the risk actually is low, and what you could find out and discover if you just try it is very, very high. You could open a whole new door for yourself. So I try to live by that, but I don't always.
I love that. It's a great way to end this. Thank you so much for taking the time. We love your book. Thank you. We're fans of you. So if there's ever any way Apartment 3C can support you, or, what comes next for you, please let us know. We are just huge supporters of your writing, and we're really honored to have you be a part of our book club.
Oh, thank you so much, Sharon. Thanks to all of you out there for reading. If there are people out there in the future.
Take care. We'll talk to you soon.